This is the Belle Books and Stories podcast with your host, Richard Dijkstra. Welcome. You're listening to the Belle Media podcast, where we take a look at some great books and the stories behind the books. In this episode, I'm speaking to journalist and author Nicholas Schmidle. Nick writes for titles such as The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and the Washington Post. A few years back, he also wrote a gripping account of a perilous 2-year journey through Afghanistan and Pakistan, venturing into areas Western journalists seldom dare enter and meeting some of the country's toughest jihadis. He's an award-winning writer, currently based in London, but he's also taught journalism at Princeton. He's here to talk about his new book, Test Gods, Tragedy and Triumph in the New Space Race. It's a story about private endeavour in space, an era that was kick-started by the launch of the X Prize in 1996, a $10 million prize to the first team to put a crewed spacecraft up into space, twice in 1 week. The book has rightly been described as Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff, updated for the 21st century. At its heart, it's a very human story about people and families, fathers and sons, tragedy and triumph, dreamers and rule breakers. People pushing on despite it all. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's really an incredible story, but before we get on to why you got involved with writing the book, perhaps you just give us a brief introduction as to who actually won the X Prize and how that led on to what became Virgin Galactic, and then also the focus of your book.
Yeah, that's actually a great starting point, because I feel like it lets us lay out a little bit of the organizational history as well as the engineering history, and helps us understand both sort of where Virgin Galactic started, why they are where they are, and some of the very key moments over the course of the past almost 20 years at this point. So as you mentioned, the X Prize was this prize that was started in 1996, and it was a $10 million prize to the first private company to put a spaceship into space twice, I think within 2 weeks. They did it within about 1 week, and with at least one astronaut on board. And then there was this asterisk where the astronaut had to come back and had to not die within like the next week or something. So a bunch of companies entered with all these crazy, wacky designs, and the company, though, that was in some ways sort of tapped to win from the get-go was Scaled Composites, which was, and you'll have to excuse me, there's some hammer banging going on in the background here, as our neighbors have decided that this would be the week to begin their massive overhaul of their home. But so Scaled Composites was sort of was tapped to be the winner, and they were this boutique aviation firm in Mojave, California. And the reason why they were considered the forerunner was because they were run by this revolutionary aerospace designer, a guy named Burt Rutan. And Burt Rutan's claim to fame was that he built and tested a new prototype every year. Burt Rutan has more aircraft hanging in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. than any other aerospace designer. He is a true visionary. He's a genius. And so Burt Rutan he built airplanes. This was his thing. And he thought, okay, well, I'm going to try and essentially make an airplane that I can stuff a rocket in the back and see if this thing can get to space. And he designed it in line with the X-planes of the 50s and 60s in the U.S. The X-1, the X-15, the X-1 being the first aircraft that broke the sound barrier, the X-15 being this rocket plane that was, that NASA was going to use to get to space before the Mercury program came in and sort of supplanted the X-15 project. And the way that Burt Rutan and Scaled Composites, they designed this mothership, and the mothership would tow the spaceship that they called Spaceship One up to an altitude of about 45,000 feet, drop the spaceship, at which point the pilot would light the rocket, fly horizontally for a few seconds, and then enter in this very steep, near vertical ascent up to the heavens, and burn the rocket motor for about 60 seconds, would get them to 328,000 feet, about 100 kilometers above sea level. And in 2004, in late September and early October 2004, they completed these 2 flights and won the X Prize. And I mean, this was just, it's hard to overestimate how big of a moment this is for the commercial space industry and just for space exploration and space travel. I mean, this is the first time a private company had built a vehicle, a spaceship. And Richard Branson had this ongoing relationship with Burt Rutan, partially because Branson was, Branson is an explorer. Branson was into hot air balloon races and building aircraft that could fly around the world without refueling and things like that. And so he knew Burt Rutan, and he took an interest in the Spaceship One project. And after Spaceship One completed its first flight, Branson said, hey, can I give you guys a couple $1 million and slap a Virgin decal on the back of that spaceship? And if you can make it to space again and prove the concept, I would like to make that, use your design as the basis for my fledgling, or at that point just aspirational, space tourism company, which became Virgin Galactic. And so that is where the idea and the kernel of the engineering design began, which is that when they completed that flight, that second flight, that is, I think maybe that day or the next day, Richard Branson announced they were going to create Virgin Galactic. And that, so that was in October of 2004. And they've been kind of having a go at trying to get it off the ground and really show that they could build a repeatable version of that, a larger version that was also safe to do it multiple times, dozens of times, if not hundreds of times. Whereas Scaled Composites, they flew these 2 flights and said, "Okay, we're done." We've sort of pushed it as much as we're going to push it. So that's the origin.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, well, I can actually vouch personally for the fact that there was also this great buzz at that time, because I myself had an interest in space tourism. I was involved with this, and still am involved with a specialist travel company, and we thought we'd have just look at what was happening. So in May 2006, I actually attended a space conference in Los Angeles, where all these various companies were talking about their plans. So, Virgin Galactic was there, Elon Musk was a speaker, Xcore, SpaceX.
Oh, wow.
Buzz Aldrin was a key player there. We flew in from London and straight into the conference, and didn't realize we had to then attend a dinner. And that dinner at night was actually a kind of an amazing time, because we were sitting beside people who had actually bought tickets.
Oh, wow.
And things, but also it started off with the guy turning around and saying, "So, just to see who's in the room tonight, stand up, all of those who've got an interest in space." So we all stood up. And they said, "Remain standing, those people that have orbited the Earth." But there was 7, 8 people still standing. And then he said, "Remain standing, all those people that have orbited the moon." And then, "Remain standing, all those people that have walked in the moon." And you ended up with 2 people. And you suddenly realize that actually, so of all of the people that are interested in space at that time are kind of in the room. There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of buzz. Everybody seemed to think that it was just a matter of time. It was 3, 4, 5 years before you could get into the full commercial flights. And it was just a race as to which of the various companies was actually going to be first.
Oh, incredible story. Wow, that sounds like an amazing evening.
I also went to an event that was in October of that year as well, which was at Las Cruces, which was the X Prize kind of celebrating the 2-year anniversary. There was a lot of rocket testing and all that kind of stuff. So the hype I can understand, and also the enthusiasm and the real confidence of it all. As I say, that was in 2005, 2006. So 15 years later, it clearly didn't work out quite like that, which kind of takes us on to 2014, would it be?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. So to say that it didn't quite work out, I mean, in some ways, I feel like, I don't know what Elon Musk was promising in 2005, 2006, but I would have to think that if someone would have told you in 2005 that NASA will no longer be flying the rockets that transport American astronauts to the International Space Station, but Elon Musk will be doing that, I think people would probably have thought you were absolutely crazy. But the seemingly more attainable pursuit at that time, which was, suborbital space tourism, like, let's just do what Scaled Composites did and Burt Rutan did, and let's just sort of go to the cusp of space and come back. And let's do that, though, once a month or once a week or, whatever, that let's pick up the frequency. I suspect that if you would have told someone that was, like you said, a few years off, they would have certainly thought it was possible, and that we would still be where we are, which is that not a single quote unquote sort of suborbital space tours has made that journey would be really surprising. So you mentioned 2014, which is really a big turning point for Virgin Galactic and as well for my interest in this story. Not to be overly dramatic about this, but kind of for my life in some ways, it was a turning point for me as a father, as a reporter, as a in numerous ways. And what that turning point is Halloween of 2014, when Virgin Galactic is planning on that morning of the 31st of October to fly its fourth rocket powered flight. And this one was aiming for about 38 seconds of rocket burn, so about 2/3 of the estimated time to get them to space. And they thought they would get up to about 180,000 feet above sea level. And there were hiccups along the way, but more or less the morning kind of went as planned. And they dropped the rocket, the spaceship. Now the mothership is called White Knight 2. It was a bigger version of the White Knight that carried Spaceship 1 aloft in 2004. So now in 2014 you've got White Knight 2, which is this big, sort of albatrossian wingspan, has this big albatrossian wingspan, and it carries Spaceship 2 up to altitude, to the drop altitude. And it's worth stopping here and pausing for a second and explaining a little bit about the engineering idiosyncrasy that Burt Rutan introduced and incorporated into Spaceship 1 and then later into Spaceship 2, which is that they were always concerned not really so much about getting up into space, but about how to get down without burning up, because the aerodynamic forces on the vehicle would be so extreme as you were coming down, breaking back through the atmosphere. And so Burt Rutan introduced this thing called the feather, which essentially it allowed the tail booms to rotate up and kind of turned the vehicle. I mean, if you kind of close your eyes and you imagine an airplane for a second, and imagine what an airplane would look like if it was folded into a taco shell. And that's what Spaceship 2 did. And by doing that, it could float down. It would create a certain amount of drag to let it sort of float down, control its reentry attitude and angle, and make a careful and controlled reentry. So that feather, they knew that they had to keep that feather locked. They couldn't. The feather was there was a locking mechanism and there was an unlocking mechanism, and then once it was unlocked, the pilot would lift the feather up, and they knew they needed to keep it locked until about 1.4 Mach, because otherwise the aerodynamic forces would push the tail up, and that was kind of, it would be like pulling the emergency brake up on your car as you're on the highway, right? And so on this particular morning, they dropped the spaceship and light the motor, and the motor burns for just a few seconds when the co-pilot made this, to this point, sort of an unanswerable mistake in which he said unlocking, and he just sort of skipped a page in the hymnal. I think he thought he was somewhere in the flight. He wasn't. He kind of had this checklist in his mind, and he just sort of skipped an item in the checklist. And he unlocked the feather, and the aerodynamic forces did what everyone knew they would do, and it pushed the feather up, and it shredded the vehicle apart in midair, and the vehicle crashed. And one of the test pilots died, the co-pilot who unlocked the feather, and the other test pilot survived. And I remembered that morning seeing this alert on my phone that Virgin Galactic's spaceship had crashed. And there was a moment for me, like there was the recognition of the tragedy of it, and there was sort of a second moment in which I just kind of wanted to stop. Like if you're sort of before a studio audience, and it's like, wait a second, stop, everyone. Wait a second. There's a British billionaire funding a private rocket company in the California desert that's testing rockets that are flown by real test pilots and not sort of automated, programmed by engineers. It sounded so immediately retro, and I thought, like, who I thought we were done doing this kind of stuff. I thought this was like, I thought that this was done with the X-planes in the 60s, and that's what really sparked my interest and motivated me to get out to California initially for a long New Yorker piece, and then which turned into this book. Right.
Now, you obviously also didn't come from this totally cold either, with your interest in things like the X-15 and planes like that, because I think you are actually, your family, there's a background in aviation. Is that not right?
Yes, my father is a kind of legendary inside of the Marine Corps aviation community, a legendary fighter pilot. He had flown opening night, first night of the first Gulf War, and had flown combat missions in Bosnia, and at the time actually was the deputy commandant for aviation, a 3-star general in charge of all helicopters and airplanes in the Marine Corps. So he had not only kind of established his bona fides as a kind of fighter jock and a Top Gun graduate and all that in his younger days, but then was kind of was the guy in charge of all the planes at that point, and took pride though not in the fact that he was the boss, but that he was the boss and still flying single-seater fighter jets at his age and competing with guys that were, in some cases like literally half his age, and that was kind of his psyche, right? So when I get out to California the first time and I meet the test pilot who would soon become Virgin Galactic's lead test pilot, at that point he was still at Scaled Composites as one of their test pilots, this guy named Mark Stuckey. He was, yeah, I'd never met Mark Stuckey before, but he was sort of immediately familiar to me. I knew the type, right? I'd
Yeah.
There was just something about the fabric of who he was that we hit it off, and so Mark Stuckey became my window into this world, and in some ways he was, I could write about my father without writing about my father by writing about Stuckey, and yeah,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, I think also when you walked in, there was a bit of a recognition from his side as well of this is a type I recognize as well. Is that
Yeah,
not right?
totally. Yeah, I mean, he told me that he'd recently seen my dad on a 60 Minutes special about the F-35. He said to me something like, that I was familiar, and that I reminded him of someone, and that someone was his flight instructor. I mean, the community of fighter pilots is really really close and really small, and just and so my dad exactly had been a flight instructor in the training squadron in Yuma, Arizona, in the early '80s when Stuckey passed through there, and so they had this overlap, and you're right. I think, and I know that having talked to Stuckey about this a bit, that we talked after the magazine piece, after the 16,000 word magazine piece that I spent 4 years working on came out, but before I finished the book, he said, like, why do you think, and he was sort of asking himself aloud, but also asking me genuinely. He said, why do you think I've cooperated to the extent that I have? And we can get into that in a second, but I was deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained in his life. He was sharing private emails and correspondences with friends and family, and ex-wives and estranged children, and just he let me into his home and into his world in a way that I exceeded any expectation that I could have had going in. And he asked, sort of, why do you think I let you in? And I said, I think that you, Mark Stuckey, know that you've lived this extraordinary life, chasing this astronaut dream for the past 40 years, through all of the traditional channels in the military, and now with with Scaled Composites, and with Virgin Galactic. And he had flown the first 3 rocket powered flights successfully, and did not fly the 4th, in which his best friend committed this unforgivable mistake and was killed, and now he was preparing to fly the 5th. And it was like, I said, and I think that when you met me, you met someone whose professional credentials you trusted, and kind of who came from a background that you implicitly thought was the right background to help tell your story as well. And I thought it was really, and he agreed, and I can, it was one of, like, the really interesting moments for me, and kind of interesting revelations in this project, which is just that we as journalists so often think that we're the ones who sort of do all the picking, right? And forget that oftentimes the subjects that we write about are also screening us and deciding whether they want to cooperate with us. And so it was ultimately kind of this really special match.
So I think one of the key issues from my point of view with the book is the fact that clearly there does seem to be this whole kind of dynamic of father-son relationships. I mean, clearly that he was aware of you as the son of his instructor, but also this 3-star general, that one of the top aces in the US Air Force. There's your relationship with your own children, with him, your father, but also there's Mark Stuckey himself, who's actually going through quite a relationship issue with his own son. They got divorced at one point, the family split up. The son clearly was very affected by that. And there's this kind of gradual coming back together again within the book. And I think it's all these kind of personal relationships that fit together. But I also think that it's also one of the things which the personal relationship within the books is so important, because also I think it links into the whole issue by Richard Branson has got involved in all of this as well, because it's the personalities, it's the fact that these planes are flown, which is actually so important to him as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so glad you hit upon that for various reasons, which is that this never felt to me like a space book, right? It never. Um, People would ask me when I told them I was working on the project, they'd say, "Oh, I didn't know you were interested in space," and I said, I'm not really interested in space. It sort of is almost incidental that all of this is happening with a space company. It certainly adds to it raises the stakes. But space, in some ways, was always kind of a metaphor for me. It was always about people trying to push literally to push the envelope, to push on into these uncomfortable places in life, to try and learn something more about themselves or about what it is that kind of we're here for, and that was always for me what grounded the book. And I remember when I was having a conversation with Mark Stuckey at one point, and he mentioned to me this very and at this point it was not a repaired relationship, but his estranged relationship and really difficult relationship with his son. And when he told me about that, and how the day of the crash, he and his son weren't talking besides a very occasional messages over Facebook Messenger, and his son had reached out to him and said, how's it going? I hope, I was really something about like I was really tripping out when I thought you might have been killed, but you weren't, and I'm glad. Stuckey had been out quite literally kind of picking up pieces of his best friend in the desert all that day, and he came back and he told me later, he said, like, I had so I it was an overreaction, but here's my son coming back to me in some ways after so long and trying to establish some contact, and I just pushed him away. And I mean, Stuckey said something like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. The son doesn't talk to dad for multiple years, and then son thinks that dad has just died and suddenly wants to be friends again. And it was just like, oh man, what a and it's like one of those things where as a father, I kind of go back sometime. I on a daily basis, I go back and I replay things that I've said to my kids, or I'm like, oh man, what was I thinking? You just try. Every day is a chance to sort of to do that better. So the book was always for me about those human relationships, and you're totally right. That human element, the human factor, is inherently what has attracted and drawn Richard Branson to this project for all these years. Richard Branson is that sort of swashbuckling barnstormer, with the scarf flapping in the breeze in the backseat of a biplane. That's the persona he's created, and that is the aura that these pilots embody. And so if you told me tomorrow, if Richard Branson was given the choice tomorrow, that I can develop for you a space tourism company that will actually be potentially more reliable and more efficient, and will look more like SpaceX, but will not feature pilots, I don't know which option Richard Branson takes, because he's that's not him, right? He's not the sort of the algorithmic genius who's trying to sort of work his way through life's problems by programming the bugs out. He's the kind of
Yeah.
guy who wants to work his way through life's problems by experiencing them and by sort of feeling and enduring the hardships. And that's that was always for me what this story was about.
Yeah, I mean, the other issue which comes in is that we're talking about it as though the book was always inevitable, but presumably, actually, originally you were commissioned to write an article. But again, probably that was something that your editor at the time was somewhat skeptical about you being able to do, because after all, you were trying to come into a company that had actually had a major setback, a major tragedy, and in a way, it seems rather odd that although I can see Mark Stuckey being interested in perhaps talking to you, the fact that Virgin were so open as well, that in some respects is quite a surprise. But again, is there a reason why that happened, do you think?
It was again personalities, right? It was really it was an instance of all the stars aligning in the aftermath of this horrible tragedy, and in the aftermath of this horrible tragedy. I mean, so for me as a magazine writer, I'm always looking. I'm always trying to think. It's oftentimes a single scene that I'll think that could be a magazine piece. That could be a 10,000 word magazine piece that I spend 4 months on. And whether it's the an undercover sting operation to nab a Russian arms dealer, or whether it's a rocket ship crashing in the desert. It's like, okay, well, I could take that single scene and I could really sort of report that out. I could do kind of a TikTok account of that. I did this 2 months after the raid that killed Osama bin Laden, the Navy SEAL raid. I took that event and slowed the time down and did this minute by minute sort of blow by blow account inside the compound. And so that was that's the kind of reporting that I like to do. And when I went to the company and told them that I wanted to embed with the company I said I wanted to essentially do what Buzz Bissinger had done in Friday Night Lights, in which he went and embedded with a high school football team for a season. I said, I want to do that with your rocket company. And I want to stay with this season for me. This defined amount of time is from now, in the immediate aftermath of this horrible crash, until the time you build a new spaceship and refly the flight that you were planning to fly on that tragic morning. And so we had a lot of discussions about that. And fortunately, the woman who was running the communications department at the time was a huge fan of Friday Night Lights. And she said, look, we have such amazing people and stories out here in the desert. And I think, that's the kind of story that I want to tell. We Virgin Galactic, she said, has been telling the kind of glamour, celebrity-driven version of the story for the past few years, as we've been, moving towards, or sort of hopefully moving towards, beginning commercial operations. But that, she said, isn't the story right now. The story right now is about sacrifice and people sort of holding on to these dreams in spite of these terrible events. And so I also had one of the test pilots was a former Marine. He was my dad's wingman on the first night of the Gulf War, and he had actually he had led the search and rescue mission when my dad had to eject from an F-18 that crashed into a mountainside in Japan in the late 80s. And this test pilot's wife had babysat for my brother and I when we were kids. So we had this really, long history, but it was a history. I mean, I hadn't talked to the guy in 30 years. And so he CJ Sturcow, went to the president, the then vice president, now president of the company, and said, look, I think Nick's the kind of reporter we would potentially want to let in. I explained the way that the New Yorker sort of did its fact checking, and he said, but I can't say anything really about what he is as a reporter, but he comes from sort of good stock. And so, there were a couple of ways that I was trying to help build my case. And then I just went into the company and I explained to them how I worked. I said, this is the way the fact checking works. I would record everything. I'm curious. I want to know. I'm going to ask the same question a million times to make sure I understand. I'm going to then go back to you before we go to print and make sure that I understand. I'm going to, the fact checker is going to go back to you. And I think that all of those sort of steps of quality control, if you will, reassured them. And look, when the book was going to print, when the magazine was going to print, and then when the book was going to print too, I saw a lot of things. I learned a lot of things. I developed relationships outside of the normal channels in which I was provided with documents and information and stories that, defied their attempt to kind of keep me on a certain narrative, but there was no ground for them to stand on to object to anything for the sake of accuracy. I mean, they would say, "Oh my God, I'm not sure. Like, we want you to say that," and I said, "Well, that's not, that's not up for discussion. It's if it's not accurate, tell me. But it's true, and it's actually very germane to the overall story." So Yeah, I mean those. I don't know what they would. I don't know if they're going to allow another reporter, embedded reporter, in anytime soon. But I feel very fortunate to have spent those 4 years inside the company for sure.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, it's someone obviously coming at it from being an interested reader of these type of things anyway. Clearly I was perhaps going to always be more interested. But I think actually the story that you tell is actually something that they would be very pleased about, really. I mean, I can understand that they've also got this issue that they're trying to sell tickets and all this kind of stuff for an experience and anything that there is this slight dichotomy between everybody wants it to be safe, but everybody wants it to be dangerous as well. I think
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Yeah, they want to be part of the glamour safely.
Right, right. Well, and they want and when people ask why they aren't flying, 5 tourist flights a month, and clearing off their 600 person roll of customers, the old maxim of space travel that space is hard. That is always there. And so the difficulty of the undertaking has to be available for the sake of explaining why they're there. But the fact that sort of no one ever wants to talk about a test pilot dying or the 3 engineers who were killed in a propulsion accident in 2007, and those I just always thought that those were as important. That the low points. I said to them at one point I was in this meeting on the eve of their first captive carry flight, in which they were just going to sort of take the new spaceship up into the air. The mothership was going to take the new spaceship up and just fly around for a few hours. And I was sitting in this meeting, and they were having a very, very candid discussion about whether they should even be having this meeting. And the reason was that there was some paperwork that wasn't ready, and one of the vice president of safety said, it was a meeting of like 8 people, like the president, the vice president, the lead test pilot, essentially the top 8 people in the company. And the vice president of safety, a former Air Force test pilot, said, "We are a failure to be having this conversation right now." He said, it's just indicative of like that. This is just, it was amateur hour. And one of the president of the manufacturing subsidiary of Virgin Galactic, called the Spaceship Company, he looked over his shoulder and he said, "I don't feel comfortable having Nick in the room having this discussion." And it was clearly an invitation to leave. And I said, without acknowledging his question, I said, "Well, I just want to thank you all for your trust and your confidence in me. And these are the moments, these moments of these trials and tribulations along the way are going to make the triumph that much sweeter, hopefully, at the end." And I said, if we don't have these moments of teeth gnashing and really sort of hard decision making, if I'm not witnessing those, then the whole thing sort of feels empty in the end. And I just said, so thank you again. And I went back to taking notes, and the meeting resumed. And I think that everyone was like, "Wow, I certainly, you were." It was a very open invitation. He could have said nothing short of, "Nick, get out of here," and somehow or
Yeah.
another you stuck around. And so, I think that I kind of kept repeating that to them, that for it to have that emotional weight, it was important, I thought, for me to be able to describe and really kind of provide an authoritative account of their difficulties along the way.
Yeah, and the process and the care that's taken in all of these things, which I think really does come through. I mean, one of the things which is interesting in all this, and it actually also goes back to that time I was at these conferences in 2006, that there's actually a really interesting kind of dynamic, I think, in a kind of culture clashes between the entrepreneurial space people, the ex-NASA guys, the military test pilots, and Virgin, that are all kind of mixed together in the project. Really, it's a kind of very very interesting set of dynamics. But the other thing that you keep coming across when you talk about all these people is, again, how there was so much disappointment in what had happened to NASA that it seemed to, in the 60s, it was the go-to organization everybody wanted to be part of, and gradually it seemed to slow down and become more and more bureaucratic. And you get that there's a whole kind of frustration with that big civil service bureaucracy that NASA became.
You talk about the themes like that, right? You talk about this frustration with NASA's failure to inspire. I mean, that NASA was the one that was doing all of the stuff that made people's jaws drop and made people just freaking proud to be Americans or humans. I mean, it was just incredible to watch, And then they went into this period of stasis, and that's not to say. I mean, I just recently wrote a short piece for the New Yorker about the rover on the surface of Mars. I mean, that is phenomenally cool stuff, right? But the question is like, what Burt Rutan often said about NASA was that they have failed to inspire. That their goal in some ways, their purpose in some ways was to fill the next generation with wide eyes and a want to learn and a want to explore. And that was where he felt like NASA had failed. And part of, I think, thematically, what I took from the process of writing and reporting this book was how all of us in some ways, all of us as fathers, like that is our purpose, is to inspire our children to approach the world with curiosity and a wanderlust, and how all of us try and do that differently, and how, to what extent, our parents have done that for us. So yes, you kind of have all of these subcultures at the company. You've got, you have Virgin Mojave almost versus, against kind of Virgin London, London being the very, Virgin London is kind of setting the marketing tone, and Virgin Mojave is saying, you got to be kidding me, guys. Like, we're not even close to flying to space. And, Richard Branson's on TV saying, it'll be 6 months. And then you have the scaled composites, these kind of, I mean, these are like, somebody said these are desert rats. These are guys that are building model cars, that have graduated to model airplanes, and then suddenly are building, model spaceships, and they don't understand, like, the cultural clash between them and the engineers that Virgin was initially hiring just couldn't have been more stark. So I thought those were always sort of fascinating from an organizational, from kind of a Harvard Business Review case study of how this organization sort of functioned, or its dysfunction. But the more universal theme of that inspiration was really kind of, I think, what drove me forward and what kept my interest in this book. And in the process of writing the book, over the course of the 7 years that I was working on it.
Well, I have to say, I think that's a fantastic place to stop. Thank you, Nick, so much for being my guest on Books and Stories. Test Gods is out now. It's published by Hutchinson. It's a fascinating subject. Well, it's a fascinating series of subjects, really. A great read. Most definitely not just for space geeks. It's a very human story, and one that's being played out as we speak. So thanks for listening. The studio production was by Perrin Sledge. I'm Richard Dykstra. There are lots of interesting podcasts in Belle Books and Stories series, whether it's Kay talking to Philip O'Donovan about how books get picked up for film and TV, or my conversation recently with John Preston about another media mogul, Robert Maxwell, in his book Fall. Hope you have time to listen to that, and also please join me next time when we're going to be exploring rewilding. So bye for now. Thank you.